You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with The Guardian's Whitehall editor, Rowena Mason, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Anita Boateng. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, Israel rules out ceasefire until hostages are freed, is the headline on the front page of The Guardian. The Express describes pro-Palestinian marches, which could take place on the weekend of Remembrance Sunday, as an affront to British values. The Times reports that Britain's chief rabbi is concerned about the possible protests. The Mirror is outraged at the shortening of the minimum sentence for the murderer of Zara Alina. Their headline, "No Justice." The Eye's headline tonight, election boost for Labour, as former Tory Chancellor Ken Clarke backs Rachel Reeves. According to the Financial Times, a tumultuous time for the US economy could end in a soft landing after promising job numbers. The Daily Telegraph leads with a story about a crisis at the BBC over a reported £1.7 billion pension bill. The front page of The Sun carries a story about an apparent romance between Manchester United player Ruben Dias and the Love Island star Arabella Chi. And The Star tells us that 1 in 5 people who suffer from hair loss have anxiety about it. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Rowena Mason and Anita Boateng. Welcome again to both of you. Let's start with The Guardian and the Israel-Gaza war. The diplomatic attempts that have been made, and several attempts we know by Antony Blinken. He's flown out to Israel more than a couple of times. He's been in the Middle East. The request for a ceasefire or humanitarian pause is fallen on deaf ears.
That's right, and we've heard today that Israel has ruled out this request for a ceasefire until the hostages that are being held still by Hamas are freed. That shows Israel going further in its response to this appalling massacre that happened than some of its international allies would have wanted at this stage. So it's increasingly out on a limb where the US and the UK have been saying that now is the time for some humanitarian pauses in order to try and address the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza. And even longer ago, the EU and some other countries have been calling more strongly for that. So Israel's been incredibly firm about this. It's got its military plan. It's gone into Gaza, and it's saying that this will continue to happen until the hostages are freed.
Yeah, so Benjamin Netanyahu doubling down, in effect, Anita, and saying that the offensive will continue with full force.
Yes, and we have seen a lot of kind of fiery rhetoric from Netanyahu and others in his cabinet, his war cabinet, as the response to the 7th of October continues to reverberate around Israel. One thing that's really interesting is this language around ceasefire versus humanitarian pause, and I think it is an important distinction. So a ceasefire would basically require, of course, both sides to obey that, and let's not forget that, Israel, it would require Hamas to agree to a ceasefire, and I can't quite see what the incentive would be there, not least Hezbollah as well, who are also very active in the area. We may talk about their role in this conflict too. So that looks like it's quite far away. And what Blinken and other, Israeli allies want is for a pause specifically for the allowing of aid to come into the country. And the fear from the Israeli perspective is that if you cease ceasefire, then there's an opportunity for hostages to be moved. It'll be difficult for them to be found in due course. So this is a very tricky line that I think Israel's allies are trying to walk, which is to keep it very firmly focused on aid, bearing in mind some of the difficulties of urban warfare in and of itself, let alone trying to extricate hostages from effectively tunnels beneath a very highly populated city.
Yes, and the Israeli worry is that it could allow Hamas time to regroup and double down on their efforts. Let's have a look at the Express and bringing the story back to the UK. And the quotes that we're hearing coming from Rishi Sunak, that he wants to see planned protests on Armistice Day banned. Why so, Rowena?
He's saying the language he's using is that a large pro-Palestinian march would be provocative and disrespectful on the weekend of Remembrance Sunday. I think he's treading quite a careful line. I'm not sure he's quite gone so far as to specifically say it should be banned. His aides are suggesting that he'd rather it didn't go ahead, but what he's doing is he's pointing out to the Met Police that they have powers in extreme circumstances to prohibit or put very severe restrictions on marches. That's done only in quite unusual circumstances. He's questioning whether this is potentially one of them. And the Met have got an incredibly difficult situation here. They're trying to tread a fine line between allowing people freedom of speech and the right to protest and trying to protect people who feel under threat as a result of some of the fringe elements of these protests that have veered into offences. So it seems at the moment like some sort of marches will be allowed to go ahead, and I think there's a dialogue about how close to potential remembrance services it will be and whether it will be at a different time. But even so, there's worries about whether there could be spillovers from the march that don't potentially abide by the parameters that the organisers of the marches have set out.
And concerns that marches could disrupt the 2-minute silence commemorating the war dead. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has gone even further, describing the planned protest as a hate march.
Yes, and I presume she's sort of referencing that quite a lot of these protests that have taken place have seen, people talking about jihad. We've heard, from the river to the sea. We've heard talk of an intifada against Israel. There has been some very provocative and some anti-Semitic posters and activity that's gone on in and around these marches. And I think that the next story we're going on to talk about really is in the Times, and that's really the chief rabbi talking about the ways in which these marches have, impacted the psyche of many people, many Jewish people in the country, and that feeling of being under threat and under pressure. And I certainly think that, we do want there to be a healthy protest and debate in this country, but it certainly surprised me and shocked me to see some of the languages that we've seen around some of these protests. And of course, many people have protested very, very peacefully, but these demonstrations are certainly something that have caused some distress to members of the Jewish community.
It is a very tricky line, as you say, Rowena, because the majority of the people on the marches are calling for a ceasefire or some sort of peaceful resolution, which is their right to do.
Yeah, and people can go out and protest on any issue, and this is an issue in which some people feel incredibly strongly about, and we've seen it in these absolutely huge marches since the beginning of the war, and emotions are just running incredibly high, which is why it's so difficult for organisers of the march to kind of keep everything under control. And we have seen, very small elements of the marches grow out of control. So this is why I think Rishi Sunak's written to Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Met, urging him to make robust use of his powers, and why we've got this warning in the Times here from the Chief Rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, who's saying it's a stain on our common humanity that so many seem to have lost sight between the moral distance between Hamas and Israel.
Yes, poignant words. The Telegraph, we have a quick look at that. They're also talking about the potential march on Armistice Day, but suggesting that Gary Lineker has sparked a a new political row because he's backing the pro-Palestinian protesters planning to march on that day. So Gary Lineker not being shy and retiring after previous exploits.
Hold the front page. Gary Lineker is pushing back against the Home Secretary in this instance and does not agree with the government of the present day. So, it's worth reading the quote in full. He says on X, formerly Twitter, do we have to do that now? I think we do. Yeah. Saying, marching and calling for a ceasefire and peace so that more innocent children don't get killed is not really the definition of a hate march. So he's pushing back against what Suella Braverman has said. And the Telegraph has a kind of decent sort of run through both of Braverman's position, but also some of the instances that have taken place during some of the marches that have happened since the 7th of October, which have included, I'm afraid to say, anti-Semitic placards, calls for jihad, and other sort of things that are kind of deeply distressing. And so it is one of those incredibly difficult lines to walk, I think, for the Met Police in particular, in wanting there to be a protest, wanting there to be kind of peaceful activity, but also concerns that if we see any activity that could affect the Senate half, and that area obviously gets kind of cleaned and prepared for what is going to be a very sombre day on the 12th. Will Armistice Day on the 11th possibly spill over into that 12th? And that would be quite a sad thing, I think, for Britain.
Still with me, Rowena Mason and Anita Boateng. We're going to take a look at the FT story on the front page, and this is Suella Braverman in the headlines again. She's wanting to curb the use of tents by homeless people on the streets. Anita, take us into this story.
Yes, so there is speculation that in the King's Speech, which is the legislative programme we're expecting to be outlined next week, that there is going to be some kind of legislation around a ban on tents in urban areas. And this is a really a sort of fascinating policy area where instinctively you might think, why would you not want to give someone who's homeless a tent? But there is some interesting sort of evidence coming out from different councils of different guidance where they have found they can be you can have lots of criminal activity like sexual assaults take place and there's not as much visibility. It's difficult to check on people's welfare. And there are some instances where it kind of makes it difficult to sort of access support because you kind of allow sort of more long-term sleeping outdoors. So it's quite a complex policy area. And I hope that if the government decides to kind of move in this direction, that they provide adequate kind of guidance and really explain the rationale behind a ban on tents if that's what ends up happening.
And Rowena, the Home Secretary is also including in her proposals a new civil offence to deter charities from giving tents to the homeless as well.
I mean, on the face of it, it does seem a very divisive thing to be doing. Obviously, we'd all love people who are homeless to have somewhere to stay indoors for the night and for them to be helped off the streets in the first place. But, given that many people will be out there and, for whatever reason, won't be accommodated indoors, it just, surely it's better to have them in a tent than half freezing, and especially going into the winter months. It's, it's sort of, even though there might be arguments for why you wouldn't necessarily encourage tents as an option, the idea of deterring charities with fines seems like a very harsh and not particularly humane way forward.
It does seem harsh, but I take on board the points that you raised, Anita. Just quickly, we've got about a minute, I think, just to talk about Ken Clarke endorsing, guess who, Rachel Reeves for Chancellor. Well, is he crossing the floor?
It's not clear that he sort of endorsed her. He said that she's reassuring and responsible, which, I'm not quite sure he sort of praised her rather than saying, I think she should be the next Chancellor.
Well, reassuring and responsible figure to run the UK economy.
I mean, I agree with Anita. He's stopped short of actually saying he wants Labour to win the election. He went on to say it's her party that worries me. Although then he did say that both, he said he wouldn't be particularly worried if either Jeremy Hunt or Rachel Reeves was the Chancellor, sort of implying some degree of him not really minding so much who it was. So, I mean, although he doesn't go the full hog and say, he'd prefer her out of everybody, it is another sort of endorsement for Rachel Reeves as being somebody who's responsible. She had Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, come out behind her previously. It's more sort of it's more material for her image as this kind of Iron Chancellor. That's how she wants to be portrayed.
boost definitely to her confidence. Rowena, Anita, thank you very much.